Hello, you're listening to Sending the Experts with Georgina Durrant. This podcast is all about teaching and supporting children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities, SEND. My name is Georgina Durrant. I'm the host of this podcast brought to you by Twinkle SEND. As a former teacher in Senko myself, I wanted to create a platform to share some of the amazing things that my guests are doing to support learners with SEND. So whether you're listening on your commute, tuning in whilst walking your dog, or curled up on the sofa with a nice cup of coffee, so much for joining us. In this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr Gavin Morgan, Chair of the Division of Educational and Child Psychology at the British Psychological Society. That's a mouthful there, isn't it? Gavin is an academic and professional tutor at UCL, academic and professional tutor and senior educational psychologist. Gavin joined UCL tutor team in 2009. Since 2006, Gavin has worked as a senior EP in Cambridgeshire and is now a senior EP in Northamptonshire. Prior to this, he was a specialist senior EP for behaviour and inclusion in Warwickshire and spent 4 years as a main grade EP in Coventry City Council. After completing his degree in psychology in 1993 and following a PGCE, Gavin was a school teacher in Northamptonshire before completing his professional training in educational psychology at the University of Bristol in 2000, from where he was awarded a doctorate in 2011. Wow. Hi, Gavin.
Hi, good afternoon.
So you're chair of the Division of Education and Child Psychology at the British Psychological Society. Can you tell our listeners what the BPS is and what it does?
I can try. The BPS, British Psychological Society, it's essentially a charity, but it exists to promote psychology to society.
Mm-hmm.
And within that, it has a level of governance of various applied psychology professions. So there's a number of divisions.
Yep.
The Division of Educational and Child Psychology being one. The biggest one is clinical psychologists.
Yep.
So also what it does in terms of professions, it's kind of sets standards and targets for training. So it kind of inspects training courses, and it has various ethical standards that applied psychologists need to adhere to. And the Division of Educational and Child Psychology, which is the professional body I'm chair of, represents educational psychologists. And within that, we're a professional body that represents the interests of educational psychologists. And we can therefore liaise with government, liaise with the DfE, people in power. So it's a very exciting time with a change of government. We've been doing lots of lobbying of politicians and new people in government, trying to influence policy and practice to support the interests of educational psychologists.
Fantastic. And so we don't presume knowledge, and I know we spoke about this just briefly before the recording. Can you tell us what an EP is, what an educational psychologist is, and what do they do day to day?
How long do we have? That's a huge question. But it's a question, honestly, it's a question I get asked very commonly, weekly. Yeah. I'm asked this question. So what does an educational psychologist do? I mean, in the broadest sense, we apply psychology to education. And we're trying to improve things for children that are finding learning difficult, that are finding difficulties managing their emotions and their behaviour. We're also trying to change perceptions of teachers. But we work very closely with teachers to develop intervention plans. We spend a lot of time in the classroom. We observe children. So what we're observing there, we're observing the child in relation to the lesson that's being taught, how that child relates to the class teacher or doesn't, if there are any problems there in that relationship, how the child relates to their peers or doesn't. Again, we're looking at how their interactions are, where are they sat in the classroom, what is the classroom environment like. So we're very kind of ecosystemic in our approach. We kind of view schools and classrooms as unique kind of cultures. Mm-hmm. And it's a real fortunate role that we've got, that we spend so many times in classrooms getting to know teachers. It's a complex role, as you can tell.
No,
what we're trying to do ultimately is build relationships with teachers, so that we can work with them to make things better for children in their classrooms and schools that are finding things difficult.
I think that would be Sorry, I was interrupting. That would be really useful to hear for teachers who have EPs because,
Yeah,
teachers on the ground are really busy. I've been one myself. I get it. You have an educational
sure.
psychologist might come into your lesson. They might be observing something. You don't, it's a very difficult one if you don't fully understand what they're actually there to do. And it can be a hard conversation to have because people presume you've got the understanding. So you can't really go up to them and be like, oh, what exactly are you doing?
No,
What exactly is
exactly.
happening? Which is really hard, isn't it?
Within that we've got various roles, which we will go on to talk about in terms of the local authority and some bureaucratic roles as well. But there's lots of myths and misunderstandings about what we're doing. I was going to go on to say that we also work with parents.
Yeah.
We're trying to improve relationships with teachers, with parents, and with peers. Kids spend a lot of time in school, but they spend a lot of time outside of school. So we're also mindful of the home environment. So we're trying to bring people together. That's what we try and do. We build relationships to overcome barriers to learning, in the broadest sense, learning being behavior as well, emotional regulation, physical difficulties, visual impairments, hearing impairments, every range of SEND within that. But to me, it's all about trying to make a difference for children and young people, and yeah, building those relationships. That's kind of what we do. But yeah, I am asked that question on such a repeated amount
No.
of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of I think a lot of teachers will be aware that the EPs play a role in the education healthcare plan, or education healthcare assessment. What is their role in that? How do they help inform it?
Again, I mean, again, we will come on to talk about other issues and some of the problems that we're experiencing at the moment. But if we take a step back, I can maybe relate it to my own experience. It's 25 years, Georgina, that I've been an educational psychologist this year. So
Wow.
I've been around, and all the kind of the biography. You may not notice from this, yeah, but I
Sorry,
have
was
been
it
around a
something I
long
can't possibly Gavin?
I have been around a long time, and I've seen a lot of changes in education, a lot of changes
Yeah.
in SEND, a lot of iterations of the code of practice. But when I first started as that kind of naive, idealistic educational psychologist, what I was trying to do was trying to prevent cases getting to the level where an EHC assessment was needed. So I'd spent a lot of time working with teachers to develop intervention plans and review those plans and change them and trying to kind of monitor how the child was progressing. And back in those days, if a school made a request to a local authority for what was then a statement,
Yeah.
I'd kind of view that I'd failed somehow
Oh,
because
right.
my psychology clearly hadn't had the impact that I wanted it to.
Oh, that's
Um,
interesting.
I
I wasn't
mean,
expecting you to say that. Yeah.
yeah. So I'd be thinking, what have I done wrong here? Clearly, there's always going to be, many children with profound needs, profound difficulties and disabilities that are going to need an extra level of support. But there's some children I think, okay, I want to try and ensure they don't get to that level. How can we change their learning environment? How can I support that teacher to provide the intervention without it getting to the stage where they
Mm.
need to ask the local authority for extra help? So, back in those days, I viewed it as somehow my fault if it went to that level. I mean, we're getting to the stage now where, because, and again, we'll explore this later, I'm sure, because of the lack of educational psychologists,
Yeah.
sometimes the only way that a school can get to see
Yeah.
somebody is to make an application for an
Yeah.
EHCP. So, I mean, essentially, if a school has concerns, if things aren't going well, and they have tried some level of intervention recommended by a professional such as an educational psychologist, then a school can apply to their local authority for additional support for an EHC assessment.
Yeah.
And we've got an important role to play in that as psychologists. So that goes to a panel at their local authority. The panel sits and decides and looks at the evidence. And again, in theory, what the panel would hope to see was that there was a degree of involvement from professionals such as myself,
Yeah.
that we'd been in a couple of times and we tried something and something hadn't worked. If that were the case, the panel then might decide to go ahead with the assessment. And if the local authority agrees to that assessment, then professionals such as an educational psychologist would be asked to go into the school to undertake an assessment.
Yeah.
And maybe we can talk about what that assessment might look like in a moment. But then the assessment takes place, other professionals alongside the psychologists, where medics, speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, if they're needed, would all write a report. That would then go back to the local authority. You can see the bureaucracy, can't you? That would then go back to the local authority, and another panel would then look through all the information, and they would decide whether or not to issue an EHC, an
Yeah.
EHCP, Education, Health and Care Plan, and potentially then another panel would decide on the level of funding. So it's bureaucratic,
Mhm.
bureaucratic, incredibly time consuming and expensive, and often a frustrating process. But educational psychologists play a key role in writing the advice, which informs the local authority of the resourcing that may well be needed to support that child.
Yeah, so you touched on it. That's really interesting. You touched on the fact that there is a shortage of EPs and that they might not have been able to go into the school before a school applies for an assessment. Does that put them at a disadvantage when they're requesting an education and healthcare assessment if they haven't had the educational psychologist in beforehand?
Yeah, disadvantage is a yeah, maybe not the word I'd use, but I think what it does, again, it goes back to what I was saying about relationships.
Mm,
So if there were enough of us and enough educational psychologists, we would build those relationships with the school and we would know those children. And again, this is how it kind of used to be in a relatively
yeah,
recent. We would know the children that were going through the system. So that relationship would be there. But quite often now, requests come in and we don't know them. So we're not
yeah,
there. So we haven't had the opportunity for early intervention.
yeah,
And that's where that kind of disadvantage might come in,
yeah,
because problems then become entrenched, because we're not able as educational psychologists to work with the teachers, to work with the parents, to work with the child, to try and improve things
yeah,
before they get to the stage where an EHC has been requested, because that's what we want to do. We want to prevent
yeah,
them getting there. We want to ensure that we can intervene before the problems get too entrenched. That might be the kind of the disadvantage you were thinking of.
yeah,
And it depends where you are in the country, but often that relationship now, over the past few years, isn't there. And,
yeah.
and, and that's where we're struggling. And that's where we're finding things a bit frustrating at the moment.
Yeah, and I haven't put this as a question beforehand, but I'm presuming that's what you would like to see changed, perhaps with the new government and whatever changes they make with the SEND system. Presumably, you'd like more EPs and more early intervention and get that relationship back.
Yeah, it's looking about how educational psychologists are deployed. I mean, you ask any profession, they say, yes, we want more, we want more, we
Yeah,
want, and of course. But I do believe, if there were more educational psychologists, then there would be fewer requests for educational health and care plans.
yeah,
And that expense, that bureaucracy, and the impact on local authority budgets for funding those would
yeah,
be decreased. So I would argue it's a bit of a lost leader. You invest a little bit in our profession to ensure that there are more of us, and that would then prevent these problems escalating, and that would then prevent the huge demand on local authorities' budgets to fund SEND provision. I mean, it's crippling many local
yeah,
authorities and putting them on the edge of bankruptcy. So, it's a huge issue.
yeah,
Um, and one way to mediate that a little bit would be to have more educational psychologists working with schools to build those relationships.
yeah. Brilliant. Sorry for going a little bit off piece
I think
topic.
that's fine.
I'm quite interested with all the changes coming up for what your
Yeah.
thoughts on that were. So if we go back to teachers and thinking about them in the classroom, what's your advice to teachers? What might signal that they might need to get an educational psychologist assessment or an education psychologist in the classroom? What might signal that that would be useful for them?
I mean, that's a huge question and an important one. I mean, I always start from the position of a child's happiness and well-being.
Yeah,
Um, an unhappy child won't learn,
no,
fundamentally. You think of those kind of hierarchy of needs,
yeah,
and first and foremost, my starting point is well-being. So, and teachers are brilliant, and teachers are aware of all their kids in their classrooms, and they pick up on signs. So it's that, how at a very basic level, how happy is this child?
yeah,
Because unhappy children don't learn, and
yeah,
therefore problems then become entrenched, because problems then escalate.
yeah,
So I would always start from that level. I mean, it depends what the level of SEND is, of course. I'm thinking of children with emotional difficulties and learning difficulties. There are clearly more visible difficulties that are clearly apparent, that we're going to need to make some physical changes to the learning environment here. But in terms of, academic progress or emotional behavioral problems, it's noticing that a child's well-being. And again, it's relationships, it's talking to people, it's talking to parents, picking up on those signals.
Yeah.
And I'd always encourage, again, I'm telling teachers what to do, that they're able professionals, but talk to parents, talk to other teachers, talk to other children. What's going on here? Before you get to the stage of inviting in an educational psychologist. But do that level of groundwork first, and just, again, communication, relationships. Try different things out. I mean, one of our roles as educational psychologists is always kind of building capacity within teachers to improve and develop their skills. So teachers themselves can try things out first.
Yeah.
Teachers have got a whole skill set behind them. Try things out, and if things aren't working, and clearly talk to your Senko at the school. Again, Senkos will have a list of kids they've got concerns with, and again, it's how it used to be in a relatively recent past. Every Senko would have termly conversations with their link educational psychologist,
Yeah.
and they would talk through new cases. And again, they'd have that dialogue. The educational psychologist would advise the Senko during that meeting, well, say this to the teacher and try this out. Even before we then come in, we can have conversations with teachers anonymously about children that are causing concerns. But again, it's that kind of plan, do, review cycle. So teachers are doing that from the start. But if there are still concerns, talk to your Senko, and then maybe the Senko can talk to their psychologist and say, please, can you come and help us?
Yeah.
But at the fundamental level, in a word, well-being and child happiness.
And like you say, teachers are good at spotting this. They know their children, they know the children in their class, and they're very good, and best placed, as well as the family, to be able to be noticing these. And I suppose as well, listening to the families, because often we hear of children that are okay in school, but they're not okay at home. And that can be a really difficult one. We know for a lot of parents that are struggling and thinking it's their fault when perhaps it's a bigger issue. And I suppose listening to families is really important as well.
Definitely. I mean, schools are complex places, families are complex places, and there's so many challenges on families and parents at the moment. So it's tough. It's really hard, and it's tough being a teacher. But I always argue that for many kids, school is a safe place.
Yeah.
And the relationship with the child has with their teacher can be really strong. That kind of attachment figure that many teachers are for kids is so important. So I mean, school, it should be seen as that kind of safe place for our children to be.
Yep. You mentioned there's a lot of problems, for teaching staff, etc. What problems are educational psychologists facing then? What are you finding at the moment?
Yeah, it's been tough for us. And it's over the past, again, few years, but certainly since the 2010 change of government,
Yeah.
there's been cuts to local authority budgets. And one way that some local authorities responded to this was they began asking schools to buy in educational psychologist time. So
Yeah.
what was previously freely delivered by the local authority, to provide some of the shortfall in funding, many schools were asked to buy
Oh my
time for
goodness.
educational
Yeah.
psychologists. I mean, which there's a whole host of ethical questions about
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
you weren't aware of that.
No, well, I think I was to some extent, but I wasn't aware that it was such a jump that suddenly it was free, and then they had to opt. Yeah.
It's different throughout the country. So there's a bit of a postcode lottery about this to some
Yeah.
extent. But many local authorities, to provide that shortfall in funding, they entered into service level agreements with local authorities to provide funding that was normally free. And that's one problem. And I'm not ethically wholly sure that's a good idea, because a need is a need, and it shouldn't necessarily come out of the school's budget. And there's a whole host of questions.
Yeah.
That's one problem. But and more recently, and again, I'm thinking kind of, there's been lots of cuts to local authorities' budgets and support services and structures that were there in a relatively recent past. Sure Start, children's centres, those kind of things have gone. So in the last 15 years, we've gone from there being lots of kind of support community structures for all children, not just those with SEND, but all children in the community to have access to high levels of support from the local authority. That's gradually been chipped away, withered away. I mean, we're still there because we've got the statutory role, but many services have just gone.
Yeah.
So we're one of the only SEND specialist services still standing. So therefore, there's lots of issues, lots of problems that are coming our way that would have gone elsewhere.
Yeah.
So we're picking up more problems, we're picking up more entrenched problems.
Hmm.
And there's less of our time because schools have been asked to pay for it, and some schools haven't got the budget to do that. So again, it all exacerbates these problems. You can see where I'm coming from. And a lot of the time, I mentioned this a moment ago, but the only way that a school can get to see an educational psychologist is to make an application for an EHCP.
Yeah.
So again, we've been asked to do more and more,
Mhm.
sometimes quite a later stage than we'd want to when the problems have become entrenched. And this is having an impact on us as a profession.
Yeah.
It's making my profession feel demoralized, feel stressed, feel
Yeah.
unhappy. Um, the statutory role, the EHC role, is an important one, but it's not the only one that we've got. And
Yeah.
a lot of psychologists get frustrated because we're not able to provide that early intervention.
Gosh, yeah, that
So,
must be really hard.
so all we're doing, all is again doing a lot of heavy lifting. All we're doing is a lot of reactive work when things
Mhm.
have become deeply entrenched. And educational psychologists are thinking, if only I'd been in 6 months before, if only I'd been in a year ago, I could have put this in place and we could have prevented this problem escalating. So it's
Yeah,
very
that's really hard.
demoralizing.
Because I recently read the BPS recently published some research that sort of reiterates what you just said, that shows over half of all EPs say they feel unable to support children and young people with their current workload. And I suppose similar to what you're saying, isn't it? Yeah. Can you tell us
That's,
more about that then? That sort of research that was out, and what you think what can be done to improve the situation, I suppose.
yeah, of course. I mean, just before the general election, the BPS, the British Psychological Society, put out a manifesto for the incoming government, and part of that, a big part of that, was about educational psychologists, and the
Yeah.
BPS said, "Look, if we're going to take this position, we need some evidence." So we did a workforce survey over the summer, and it was quite stark that the evidence that we got. So this is yeah, brand new, fresh evidence that we've got about the kind of impact of this on our profession. And what we're finding is that many previously employed local authority educational psychologists are leaving local authorities. And
Yeah.
what they're either going into private practice or they're becoming a locum psychologist because, again, if all you're doing is advice for educational health and care plans, you can earn
Mm.
more money by becoming a locum and getting employed to do the same job. So,
Oh,
many
goodness.
psychologists are leaving to become locums. And there's also kind of private enterprise companies as well that are now employing psychologists. And yeah, they're doing a great job, but what they're not doing is the statutory work. So, but they are able then to provide that, build those relationships with schools,
Yeah.
but because but it's still the local authority EP that legally has to do the advice. Do you see what I mean?
Absolutely.
Private psychologists can't do the
It
statutory advice.
it must be hard though. I imagine if you've trained as an AP and then you become it, and but you don't want to perhaps just be doing
I don't, I don't,
the
I,
assessments. You want to be
exactly,
helping at the start. That's why people go into these jobs, isn't it? Why teachers go
exactly.
into teaching. You want to be there at the start to make a difference. So you
Yeah,
can start kind of see, even if it
right.
wasn't to do with money, why people would do that, because they want to be
No.
there at the beginning.
You're absolutely right. No educational psychologist went into this career to write reports, to be
No.
a bureaucrat. It's an important part of what we do at the moment. But nobody, if you speak to you know, psychology graduates or those thinking about their career, no one says, "Do you know what I want to do? I want to sit at my desk and write reports all the time." We want to be in schools. We want to be
Yeah.
building those relationships, working with teachers, but we're not being able to do that because all, again, it's different throughout the country. But our, research findings suggest a lot of educational psychologists, all they're doing is the bureaucratic report writing, which isn't necessarily making a difference for the children that really do need our support.
Yeah. And so we've mentioned about local authorities having to buy in EPs. What do you think about some academy chains employing their own educational psychologists rather than the ones from the local authority? Is that good, or is that a bit of a conflict of interest?
Yeah, I mean, I touched on it just now. I
Yeah.
can understand why many local authority EPs might find that an attractive thing to do because they're able to work directly then with schools that like they were trained to do. But what it's having that kind of acute negative impact on those psychologists that are still employed by the local authorities, because they're the ones that legally have to write the statutory advice for the local authority. So, yeah, I mean, and the other issue is the conflict of interest maybe comes in because our training is funded by the government. The government fund universities to train very few of us each year, but we do receive, taxpayers funding for,
Yeah,
for,
yeah,
for, for us to be trained. So therefore, the Department for Education therefore hope that we go and work in local authorities and, make a difference and write the advice for all these plans. But that's not happening. So yeah, it's probably, yeah, I can see why many psychologists might think that's an attractive career option, but it's having an acute level of difficulty on those educational psychologists that are still employed by local authorities.
yeah. Now, one of my last questions then, if there's a teacher listening to this, now that you've told there's quite a few problems to do with educational psychology at the moment, if there's a teacher listening to this who actually thinks, a career in educational psychology may be something they're interested in, what advice would you give them?
It's
Don't
a
say don't do
great,
it.
it's a great career. I mean, we're having a few frustrating issues at the moment. Yeah, again, it hasn't always been like that. I've been around a long time.
Yeah.
I got raised into specs and I can look back and see how things were. I think we're so important. It's the one career where you can really make a difference
Yeah.
for all children, because every child with a difficulty, with SEND, with a problem, is an opportunity to learn.
Yes.
It's not an opportunity for all of us to learn, whether we be a teacher, a psychologist, a peer, or the child themselves. We're all learning from that interaction. And it's the one career that you are doing that on a repeated daily basis.
Yeah.
It's such a rewarding role. We can make a real difference to the relationship between a pupil and a child, but also the community and the whole school. So it's such an important career, and it is so rewarding. So I don't want to put any teacher
No.
off considering doing it, because it's a vital role, and we do play a vital role in our school system. It's just that, yeah, we have, like I said, a few issues at the moment. I mean, where we want to get to is to get back to that level where there was that relationship between a link educational psychologist, the local authority. We were working together, we were building those relationships, we were developing intervention plans together.
Yes.
That's where we want to be. We want to be out there working with our teachers, because it's so important.
Yeah, and I can imagine when you're doing it like that and you're doing it how it should be, it's a brilliant career and a brilliant job.
Absolutely.
And yeah. Before we finish, it's been absolutely brilliant having you. Are there any links that you'd like me to add on the podcast so people can go to? Any websites do you want us to send them to? Do you want to send them to the British Psychological Society, for example? Any websites you recommend?
There's lots of resources and links that I can certainly share with you, offline once
Yeah,
we've
that sounds good.
we can add those. I'm more than happy for people to contact me. I'm easily findable. But yeah, very happy to provide you with.
I will add some links then. So those people that are listening now, or if you're watching on YouTube, you're on the phone. If you're listening, if you scroll down, you'll be able to see these links that we're just discussing now, or you can look on YouTube just below, and there'll be some links there. And we've also got useful resources with Twinkle that are related to this episode. You can have a look at those. Thank you so much, Gavin. You've been a brilliant guest. I've learned so much about EPs and everything. It's been fantastic. Really appreciate your time.
Okay, many thanks.